Well, hello, everybody. So grateful to be with us here at ULT San Diego for the Aquarian series. This evening's presentation is on the astrological sign of Taurus, and that will be given to us by Dr. Ken Campos. So to begin this evening's presentation, a reading from Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms. Attention, contemplation, and meditation are anterior to and not immediately productive of that kind of meditation in which the distinct cognition of the object is lost, which is called meditation without a seed. There are two trains of self-reproductive thought, the first of which results from the mind being modified and shifted by the object or subject contemplated. The second, when it is passing from that modification and is becoming engaged only with the truth itself. At the moment when the first is subdued and the mind is just becoming intent, it is concerned in both of those two trains of self-reproductive thought, and this state is technically called nirvana. Nirodha. In that state of meditation, which has been called nirodha, the mind has a uniform flow. When the mind is overcome and fully controlled, its natural inclination to consider diverse objects and begins to become intent upon a single one, meditation is said to be reached. When the mind, after becoming fixed on a single object, ceased to be concerned in any thought about the condition, qualities, or relations of the thing thought of, but is absolutely fastened upon the object itself, it is then said to be intent upon a single point, a state technically called ekagrata. And now we give you Dr. Ken Campos.
Well, thank you, Monica, for that wonderful opening quote. I love it. Well, so glad to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to give a talk today. Well, today is the 25th of May, and we're on the astrological sun sign of Taurus. And the inspiration here is from Helen Valborg's book entitled Theosophical Astrology. Let me see if I could move our people aside here. There's a way to minimize the, except I don't see my arrow. Sometimes it's submarines. So we're on page 115 of the book Taurus. Just wanted to make that one a little smaller.
I apologize. I'm going to have to.
Oh, there it is. Oh, there's the arrow. Yeah.
You want to just get rid of this thing, right?
Oh, make it smaller. Either way. Yeah, that's good. And then go back to play again. Yeah. All righty. Fantastic. I'm going to go back to play. And back in the fall of 2023, a couple months ago, we heard a wonderful presentation on the clock. This provided us with some foundational ideas for looking at the zodiac and the 12 individual signs. The interesting quote from Hermes, I'll read it, is, "Man is a sevenfold potential God who must progress around the 12 signs of the celestial clock until he has mastered the forces of each one of them in his own nature." That'll be his or her own nature. And then in January this year, we heard another wonderful presentation, and these are on YouTube, by the way, on the zodiac. It was an overview of all 12 signs and then some other preliminaries. The quote here is, "The zodiac symbolizes an entire cosmic cycle of evolution and dissolution. The zodiac signs are ideographs, hieroglyphs with number, color, and tone. So that sort of sets the stage. And then Helen Valborg, from one of the authors of the main author of the book I was showing you the cover of a moment ago, has this quote: "Man is a sevenfold potential God." Again, I read this already, I'll say it again. "Man is a sevenfold potential God who must progress around the 12 signs of the celestial clock until he has mastered the forces of each one of them in his own nature." So it's both an archetypal big thing and then our small, oops, go back here. And then the quote from today, which we saw a moment ago as Monica was introducing us, is this quote: "Taurus encompasses an archetypal process of fecundation, proliferation, assimilation, and refinement." So there are four functions: the fecundation or growth, proliferation, expansion, assimilation, to assimilate, ruminate, absorb, and then refine is to do like a alchemical transmutation. So one thing that we talked about in January with the other presentation was the involution and evolution. So starting at the top there, we have Aries as the first of the signs. Second is Taurus, today's topic. And the involution is where Purusha or self or pure consciousness goes into the first sign of Aries and then continues this descending process of the spirit into matter or material form. The next stage of the cycle is going in the other direction, from matter, or some say in an abstract sense, it's not really actual matter, but the principle of becoming matter. And you might say from modern physics, that would be the quantum mechanical aspect of subatomic particles, or even before that, something like a Higgs field, the structure of the universe that isn't matter quite yet. It's not even subatomic particles yet, and then eventually it gets into matter. So we have matter then going back towards spirit, and that's the prakriti or nature. And a latent potency, as prakriti goes back to the latent potency of Purusha. The article from Helen Valborg opens with a poem, which was a little bit obscure. It's about Phorcys, one of the several primordial ocean gods in Greek mythology. He was the brother of Kronos. But Phorcys was actually more famous for his children. He had a bunch of mythological creatures. One of them was the Gorgons, and there were three of those. But the famous Gorgon is Medusa from mythology. So I'll read the quote. "From Father Plough descend the furrow sons, through whose rich loins a numerous issue runs. From parent blossoms, daughter's fruit succeed, as Phorcys comes before his numerous breed. Thy laws personified still rule the whole, of which thy Minos is the life and soul." So that takes us to King Minos of Crete, this island here in the lower part, sort of parallel to Cyprus, between Greece and Turkey, is where the Minoan Empire was. King Minos is there, and by Heraklion, a little town on the top of the island of Crete, there was Knossos, which is the place where King Minos lived. And he had this imposter syndrome. He didn't really believe he deserved to be the king, and he got all twisted up, psychologically about that, and asked Poseidon to give him a sign. And the sign was a bull. And so he did give him the sign, and this resulted, once this bull appeared near the island of Crete at Knossos, he didn't do his part of the deal with Poseidon, which was to sacrifice the bull, and he let the bull roam around. In this initial paragraph, Helen Valborg mentions in her panoply, this almost like a Christmas fruitcake, very rich little chapter here. She mentions the bull jumpers, and so here is a scene of what did they call? A mural painted on the wall in Knossos. It's been reconstructed of these guys, sort of like thousands of years ago. Today we have the X Games, where people are, riding motorcycles over parked cars, or skiing down hills, or jumping off of tall cliffs. So in those days, they just jumped over bulls. And this is one of the things that she makes reference to. So the sea foam actually was another god, and that coalesced into form, which is part of what Taurus is about, that coagulation into form. Interestingly enough, this ties with a whole lot of different sort of human and anthropological and cultural issues. I mentioned that the imposter syndrome, King Minos, he failed to sacrifice the bull. The bull and his queen fell in love, and she gave birth to a minotaur. Now, interestingly, in early horticultural societies, and people were mixing animals together already, so it wasn't like a totally new idea to mix different things together and see what you got. One example is a horse and a donkey. You know, when you breed those animals together, you get a mule, which is sterile. The article then proceeds in her quick panoply. I'll give a little overview of it. Taurus is the bull ruled by the planet Venus, a feminine aspect. And you might say that Taurus then represents the mother. Aries, the first of the zodiacal signs, is ruled by Mars, a more masculine figure, and that would be then the father. And so Taurus is both part of the process of reproduction, but also encompasses both and is connected to both Purusha and Prakriti. From The Voice of the Silence, there's a quote which Helen Valborg mentions. I'll read it here. And it's a hint. Before the soul can comprehend and may remember, she must unto the silent speaker be united, just as the form to which the clay is molded is first united with the potter's mind. Don't mind the typos there. So the clay being molded to the potter's mind really is about intention. So there's an intentionality here. So this points to the idea of consciousness, or the Purusha, this latent potentiality that gets symbolized by Taurus. And on the sidebar, I have a picture of a book called the Edda, a translation into English of some Icelandic literature. And in her, I guess, sort of like Christmas fruitcake of putting a bunch of things in the article like Blavatsky does, Helen Valborg mentions there's other gods which are symbolized by bulls. One of them is Thor from this Icelandic Edda, another epic poem like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Mahabharata. And then mentions that Osiris, I didn't know that, was also symbolized by a bull. So these bovine symbols that go along with Taurus are part of what we're thinking about with those four functions. She then goes on to say in her article about the equinox signs, first Taurus, then there's Leo, Scorpio, finally Aquarius, with the equinoxes and the solstices astrologically, which then connects to the cultivation cycle. So a lot of early civilizations were really intent on the stars to tell them when to plant and when to harvest and all that kind of sort of thing. We have Stonehenge in England. In Mesoamerica, there's Chichen Itza. And she says that this undulating, Helen Valborg says this undulation of the stars through these major signs can be seen like a sine wave, I think of that, or a serpent wave. And I'll talk a little bit more about Fohad in a few minutes. Symbolically, did the different 12 signs correlate with different parts of the human body, going along with this as above, so below, and these correlations and these analogies. So Taurus governing the throat also gets connected to word and sound, and then this very mysterious concept of the logos, which is both in our theosophical writing and the philosophical writings from the Mediterranean, and then in Christianity with the logos. She then goes on to say that Taurus is also adorned with the pearls of the Pleiades, and here's a sort of a picture of the Pleiades. There's a better photo which gives the constellation Taurus. You can see the little outline of Taurus, and then Aries and Perseus, the other constellations. And you can see how the Pleiades are right there in the middle of the Taurus, kind of near the heart, you might say. The eye of Taurus, which we'll get to, especially at the end, is Aldebaran, and it's a bright red star. She then goes on in this rather panoramic sort of National Geographic article talking about so many different things, to mention then the Epic of Gilgamesh. And about 5,500 years ago, there was an empire in the Middle East, the Akkadians. She references the Akkadians. And a lot of people were told that the Epic of Gilgamesh and that big cracked cuneiform tablet is part of the Epic of Gilgamesh on several tablets. That's just one of them. A lot of people were taught in many different history classes, even back in high school in the 70s, it was saying this is the oldest, written literature that exists. Well, it turns out there's actually stuff that's about 1,500, almost 2,000 years older than that. And on the lower side, you can see some really primitive, sort of like proto-cuneiform. And there's even early primitive Egyptian hieroglyphs too, before the Egyptian pharaonic empire started about 5,000 years ago. So maybe like 5,500, you had these more primitive symbols. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is important here. And there's another character in this epic. It's a friend of Gilgamesh who actually, somewhat like the Minotaur from Crete, from King Minos, is a character that is like a primitive human. He's like a pre-human, Enkidu. And in part of the epic, which really is a giant flood story, but part of the epic, Gilgamesh is upset because Enkidu is fated to die in the story. But Enkidu is depicted as, again, like the Minotaur, part human and part bull or part animal. So it's a very curious sort of mixture of mixing critters together as we go in advance with evolution. Some of the aspects of Taurus are astrologically, it goes with the element of earth from the earth, air, fire, water elements. And that goes along with cultivation, which we'll talk about more later. And in astrology, there are three different types of the 12 zodiacal signs: the cardinal, mutable, and fixed. And they each have their own qualities. And then when you get to the kind of the human everyday newspaper sort of astrology, there's some ideas too with the cardinal, mutable, and fixed. So cardinal signs, they're very active. They have a direction of kind of a purposefulness going with them. The mutable signs are involved with transformations and transitions. For the person, they may have some ESP or premonition skills and abilities if you're dominated by that sun sign. The fixed sign people have a tamasic nature. And in the three gunas of, sattva, rajas, and tamas, the tamas one is thought to be very sedentary. Some people even give it a rather negative aspect, but it really isn't. It's a very stable aspect. And the human under the Taurian and other fixed signs are considered to be dedicated and persistent. And those are some of the three aspects of the 12 zodiacal signs. So there's 4 in each of those 3 categories. There's 4 cardinal, 4 mutable, and 4 fixed. And Taurus is one of the fixed signs. Next, I wanted to talk about another aspect of Taurus, which is the Nidanas. And here's something from the January presentation, that really wonderful presentation, that overview of all 12. We had some of the aspects of the different signs. In the case of Taurus, we have impressed matter, Aum, that amazing sound that encompasses really all sounds. Sound in general, the eye of Taurus, latent fohat, and gaining one-pointedness. On the other thing, we already talked about the planet Venus, that feminine aspect to an otherwise masculine seeming symbol of Taurus, a bull, and the element of earth from the earth, air, fire, water, the modality of being fixed. And then I wanted to touch a moment on the Nidanas. And there's 12 of those, and they're from Buddhist philosophy. And the Nidanas are a concatenation, sort of a causation of things, going first 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, different things that go one into the next. And to be a little bit humorous, many of you may recall Rube Goldberg machines, where there's something that happens that triggers something else that goes on to something else. So dependent in origination. So in the Rube Goldberg thing, you have a boxing glove, which hits a bowling ball, which knocks over a bowling pin, which then pulls up a piece of wood, which then opens a door and a bird gets out of the bird cage. And when that happens, a little billiard ball falls down and rolls down a ramp to a second ramp, to a third ramp, and then it goes to a series of like dominoes, bricks, and the domino bricks then cause an axe to cut a rope. And when the rope is cut, this heavy jug falls down onto the stool. And then when that falls down, it lifts up a hammer, which then hits a hand and takes it off the scale, causing an imbalance. And then the hand, which is connected to a string to a light bulb, goes down because it's heavier than now the little hammer is lifted up, and it turns the light on. So we have a concatenation of events, one causing the next, causing the next. So in Buddhism, there's dependent origination. And so it starts with avidya, and then goes to sankhara, which in Sanskrit, we usually say what's my word? samskara, that's it, samskara. They have different alliterations in the English language. And then opposite of Taurus is Scorpio. And so opposite on this cycle of 12 dependent origination nidanas is Tanha, or desire. And that is the opposite zodiacal sign of Scorpio is connected to Tanha. And the Tanha is interesting, opposite of samskara. Tanha is that desire, which is apparently what we think of as that desire, that attachment to being in human form that perpetuates the cycle of reincarnation. So rather than going into the devachanic state and then not reincarnating back in a human form, Tanha, that desire, keeps us coming back again. So being able to conquer Tanha, as the quotes were saying, to go through each of these 12 things and then one by one get mastery of them. Samskara is really a collection of things. And in terms of that, it's considered the samskara, or the other transliteration. Again, going from one language to another is tricky into English, and the spelling. But samskara is the one I'm more familiar with. It's considered a mental formation or a mental impression, or it could be recollections from different karmic incarnations, karmic residue accumulations. So it's something that comes into life, and that with the Taurus energy, we want to be aware of that, bring it back to consciousness, and then through those processes of assimilation, rumination, and then transformation, handle the samskara. Another way to think of samskara is a bundle. It's a bundle of things in Sanskrit language. So it's a bundle of different qualities and aspects. Some might say atoms, not the physical atoms, but kind of like these philosophical Buddhist and Hindu and theosophical atoms that come together to form our individual personality. And so that's its bundle of things that we bring into each incarnation. So dependent in origination, again, is these 12 concatenations, like the Rube Goldberg sort of funny thing. It's in Buddhist philosophy. And like I mentioned, opposite of Taurus is Scorpio. The next on the top on the left-hand side of this drawing of Taurus and the different qualities is impressed matter. And so we bring different things into material form, like in that initial Greek mythology story of the imposter syndrome king asking Poseidon for a sign, and then the bull coming from the foam of the ocean, then coalescing. So impressed matter, you might say, is that process in which things go from the abstract, from the intentionality, from the potentiality, then into a physical form. And Helen Valborg, in her sort of a Whitman sampler, or you might say a Christmas fruitcake of a bunch of different stuff, talks about human archaeological ages, going from the hunter-gatherer, then we have the agrarian, then we have the Iron Age, and the horticultural people that were able to, using the plow on the earth, and then to plant seeds, and the fecundation or growing stuff was a really important development in human society. That is, again, symbolized with Taurus. And here we have a picture of some oxen, which are kind of like bulls. And who knows, they might have used bulls too. I wasn't there at the time. So animal husbandry, this crossbreeding of species I mentioned, and I give the example of horses and donkeys going to a sterile mule and other animals. So humans were beginning to learn all these clever things, crossing plants. So maize, for instance, what we use as corn, started out as a really simple grass, and it was cultivated by these early gardeners who were trying to get some food for their little village and for civilization. So the fecundation was a really important part of the Taurian energy. And the horns of the Taurus are symbolic of the plow. And so that was an Iron Age development. And again, I want to mention that what she's talking about in this article is really you might say, the common everyday history of archaeology, but in Secret Doctrine and Anthropogenesis, Volume 2, Anthropogenesis, there's a more elaborate theory of, human development. But sticking to this, like college university version and history, we have, the Akkadians and the other civilizations. And then this idea of the animal husbandry is, again, reminiscent of the Minotaur myth from King Minos. The potential of Taurus is attached, as I mentioned, both to Purusha and Prakriti, the spirit and matter. growing of crops. Helen Valborg mentions some of the etymology, the delving into the source of words, the etymology, talks about Latin cultus, which had different meanings in English of care, adoration, or culture. Also, we think of the negative thing of cults, but it has a very abstract kind of meaning, not just negative, but adoration is very positive. Culture, civilization, these are very important and positive things. And the Latin came from the earlier Greek language, kyklos, or circle. And then from the Proto-Indo-European languages, we got Sanskrit, so even those earlier, more ancient languages. And then we have a similar word to cultus and kyklos, which was chakra. So interestingly enough, the human dialects, you might say, you can almost call these human dialects on the planet as people are trying to make sounds and communicate thoughts and ideas. So chakra is the wheel or movement. It has those ideas. And of course, we're very familiar with the 7 chakras that are part of our Hindu ideas. She then goes on to say, with all this talk about language and words, that Taurus, in this sense, represents the human capacity to use symbols and the symbols to allow us to get to words. And then this allowed us to have these mental functions as humanity developed more and more monastic or mental capacities to develop these complex relationships with different things, and then cultural relationships with different people and other folks and animals and plants and other civilizations and villages of folks. On the left-hand side, we have the impressed matter, Om, sound, eye of Taurus, and latent fohat. So latent fohat is something she touches on with, earlier I mentioned the astronomy, the undulation. So going into that a little bit deeper, the serpentine undulation is really a fascinating thing. And the sine wave is actually, mathematically, if you take a circle and have the diameter of it, and then maybe just a radius of the circle compared to the circle, and maybe put a cross on the circle, you'll get an angle, so with degrees. And as you move the diameter line around the circle, the angle will get bigger and smaller, be positive and negative, and that serpentine circular motion then results in a sine wave, which is like a snake. And from Mesoamerica, it's absolutely amazing to me. In Chichen Itza, which I happened to visit once, I was not there on the spring equinox, but on the spring equinox today, the corners of this rectangular stair-step pyramid make a shadow on the stair-step. And the shadow is a bunch of waves, like a sine wave. Now, how these ancient astronomers and construction guys figure this out, I have no idea. So it's like, this is pretty amazing. And a close-up on the bottom of the pyramid, I actually walked on this pyramid, but again, not on the spring equinox. There's a statue of, at the bottom, the head of a serpent. And that's in the Mayan mythology, it's Kukulkan. And then the Aztecs called him Quetzalcoatl. And this was some serpentine creature from mythology. So again, Taurus gets connected to all these different things. How these old people from another civilization figure this out, I don't know. But perhaps the Secret Doctrine Volume 2 with anthropogenesis gives us some better clues as to how this got figured out by some, what we think of as ancient primitive cultures who were able to do this amazing architecture and figure out how this could be a zodiacal and like Stonehenge, except this is much fancier than Stonehenge. That's connected to the seasons and the suns and the movement of the planet Earth around the sun in our solar system. The other part of those 4 elements of Taurus, the fecundation, proliferation, rumination, is the rumination and assimilation, one of those 4 parts. And ruminants are a name for cows and the bovine species of animals. So I just wanted to go into that linguistic thing for a moment here. And saying how, on the one hand, it is tamasic, it is sort of stable, and the cows and us as mammals, cats and dogs, animals, humans too, we all use this peristalsis thing because as biological critters, we're similar. Unlike cows, that we don't have all these different stomachs. They have a bunch of different stomachs. And so they have their first one called the reticulum, the blue one is the omasum, they have the abomasum as their 4th one, the first one being the rumen, where the word ruminant comes from, as they use it to digest the coarse plants that they eat. Peristalsis is that you might say, a ritual, not a ritual, a periodic movement of the small intestines. So there's again, an undulating type of function that happens in the gut of cows and humans. And in our nervous system, everyone's probably pretty familiar with the fight or flight responses. That's excitatory over the sympathetic nervous system, usually run by adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine. And then the rest and ruminate is the other half of it, the parasympathetic, and that's mostly run by acetylcholine. And that's the calming down stuff. And that's what allows us to digest stuff. So with Taurus, and even though it is tamasic, it's essential and very important. So with these three gunas of Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva, we have to sort of honor the tamasic energy of peristalsis and rumination because it allows us to digest things, like this cow here. And then here in a human diagram, we have the small and large intestine here, going from the stomach, we have the different parts there, the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, then it goes to the colon. And it's interesting, it says that in the average person, it's about 15 feet in length. So it's a pretty long bit of tissue, like a large garden hose. It has this smooth muscle that normally uses this peristaltic motion, this rhythmic, just like all the rhythms, like the rhythms of the seasons, the rhythms of the equinox. So as above, so below. We have these echoes of things over and over again, like you might say fractals, where something happens and then you see it again in another way, and it's again and again, and these patterns and these correlations and correspondences repeat over and over again. And one of the last parts, I don't have a lot of slides on it, is the liver. So after things go through the intestinal tract in humans and cows and other mammals, then they get absorbed. So we have this rumination, absorption. So things get broken down and absorbed. And then those molecules are then in our bloodstream, and then they'll go to the liver. And in our liver, there's this complex set of enzymes which break things down even further to more simple molecules that we can use to, work our muscles and our nervous system and all that sort of thing. And they're called the cytochrome P450 enzyme system. And believe it or not, I spent 4 whole years, well, really 3.5 years of my own life in a biochemistry lab, working on an enzyme system in a biochemistry lab. That was the only one that's similar. There are 2 systems. It's the arginine monooxygenase enzyme. It's similar to the cytochrome P450s. Closing up then, she talks about the eye of Taurus and the gaining one-pointedness. So I mentioned that the eye of Taurus is the star, that bright red star, Aldebaran. It's the 13th brightest star that we can see from planet Earth here. And there are 57 stars that were used historically by sailors, like the Phoenician sailors in the Mediterranean Sea, and then other sailors, like those Icelandic sailors, the Vikings, that use stars for navigation. So historically, different cultures use 57 different stars. And I don't know much about the Chinese and Japanese. I'm sure they use their own stars as well. In fact, they even identified a supernova in Orion's belt about the year 10,000. So Aldebaran is the eye of Taurus. And it's not to be confused with Alderaan, which is in the Star Wars movies. It was the home planet of Princess Leia that was destroyed by the Death Star in the evil empire. But we have Aldebaran. So as one meditates on the star, not the fictional planet, we have the eye of Taurus. And again, you can think about these 4 functions from the beginning and from the Hermes quote: fecundation, proliferation, assimilation, and refinement. And I have to say, doing these kind of talks is sort of the opposite of Toastmasters, where you want to use really simple words that everyone can understand. But these are complicated polysyllabic words: the fecundation, proliferation, assimilation, refinement. And the fecundation, as we talked about, is the growth, the cultivation, the biological reproduction, even the animal husbandry, the minotaur, all these different sorts of things that happen. Proliferation, the sea god from the initial poem at the beginning of Helen Valborg's article, Phorcus, who was famous for all of his progeny, all the different mythological creatures that he was the father of. Assimilation is part of that digestion process by analogy. And, mentally and spiritually, we assimilate things as well. And you might say part of the task of Taurus from an abstract perspective is to assimilate all of the samskaras from past incarnations, that karmic collection of things. We want to assimilate that and digest that. The refinement, like the liver function, is then in our process to do the transformation. And as we meditate on the Eye of Taurus, as Helen ends her article, and going back to the initial quote that Monica read us, we have these symbols of Aleph and zero. And curiously, even in this BOTA, the Builders of the Adytum tarot card, like the Rider-Waite deck, on the red bag, which is on the pole, you might say the bag is the fool carrying past historical things, like the samskaras. And there, it's hard to see what it is, but there's a little brown eagle or some falcon bird symbolizing Scorpio on the red bag. So the Eye of Taurus, she quotes Helen Valborg, one may intuit zero beyond the one as you do your meditation on the Eye of Taurus, getting to that one-pointedness. The eye of the bull is symbolically connected to Aleph. And here in the tarot decks with the Tree of Life going from Kether or the crown to understanding, which I believe is Bina. You have the Fool, that one card is the link between those. The top three are called the Supernal Triad, which Helen Valborg mentions as well. As you think about these things, you're led to the intuition of Aleph is 0 going to 10, and that being the sum of all things. And you can do the gematria or the numerical, what is it called? Number reduction. The 1 plus 0, you get back to 1 again. That 0 point, like in the proem of the Secret Doctrine, is the start of everything, and then we have the point, and then the 1 and the cross. This can lead us in our meditations of one-pointedness to the mysteries of the cosmos, meaning the whole universe or the multiverses. And then we have the mystery of the logos, of the word. And then further, as one meditates one-pointedly, you can then get some intuitions on the generative power of creation. With that, we stop the sharing, and thank you for being here on this little presentation. Now we're open for any questions or comments.
Well, thank you, Ken. That was real comprehensive. A lot of work went into that, historically and mythologically and anatomically presented. Thank you so much.
I'm a doctor, remember?
I know, and I'm trying to write as we go, but I'm afraid I missed some information. It went pretty quick. But thanks so much. And I do have a couple questions or maybe comments, but I want to make sure I open it up for everybody out there who may have a question or comment or need clarification. Please raise your hand, your virtual hand. And if not, I can start.
Yes,
so she writes in her, I'm going to try and get to the right page here. She writes a little bit about the horns of the bull. And we know when we talked about Aries, there was similar things happening with the horns because they're both given kind of this designation of fertility. But it seems like the bull's horns are doing something slightly different because she references plowing. That the bull's horns are then to plow the fields. So it's almost like Aries sets the idea, being that creative fire force. It precipitates to the ground karmically and all of the stuff that needs to be worked on. And then the bull takes that matter and does something with it, just like the potter with his wheel. I wonder if you could speak about that. She writes in here, but the bull did more than sacrifice its life for the development. It gave its crescent-shaped horn as inspiration for the plow, just as the Babylonians said of Enlil, he has caused the plowshare to impregnate the earth. So throughout the Mediterranean world, the horns of the bull symbolize the plow, which opened Mother Earth, that she may be impregnated with seed. Cultivation of the earth became the reflection of the hidden and deeper development symbolized by Taurus. So it's kind of like a more refined development. I think you talked about that as part of the four: fecundation, proliferation, assimilation, and refinement. It seems like all along the circle, at particular arcs in the circle, there's a emphasis on building something that's been planted. And I noticed that just in civilizations where you'll have ideas that proliferate, but they're kind of in the ether. And it might take a couple of centuries before those ideas really precipitate. And then we see those cycles actually quicken in the Kali Yuga, so that we have this technology seemingly happening on a constant speed. I'm wondering if you could, going back to the idea of the horns, can you speak to that a little bit about what they might actually mean, or what Ms. Valberg meant by them?
Yes, thank you for that kind of summary and commentary, and actually reading part of that was from page 121 in the Theosophical Astrology book. The crescent shape of the horns, Helen Valborg also mentions, is symbolic of cyclicity, and the whole idea that we're going through these different cycles through our annual season, which then connect with the growing season for plants and animals, from the spring, summer, winter, spring, summer, fall, and winter, that sort of thing, going from the different equinoxes on the northern and southern hemisphere, the equinoxes, the solstices. So the horns are, with a crescent shape of the moon, kind of analogous to and symbolic of the waxing and waning of seasons and different cycles of things. And then connecting it to the plow is a similar but different sort of aspect, but it also has to do with again, that fecundation, growing, and she does give a fairly sexual analogy of the earth being impregnated by seed and that sort of thing. But yet it is a part of these correspondences. And at one level, on the more abstract level, you could say that the that potential thought or intentionality of consciousness, the Purusha, the pure consciousness that hasn't manifested into anything yet, it then inspires the existence of Prakriti, the nature, the primordial nature, which again is going to be something like that process that happens in the earth when you're plowing and planting seeds and things like that to grow wheat or corn or other sorts of food crops. There's this process that goes from the seed to forming little roots, and with that whole biological process, then the plant gets above the dirt and you get some photosynthesis happening and all this biochemical stuff. It is amazing how seeds can exist and hold on to this. As someone, in my own personal life, studied a lot of biology over the years, I was amazed that there's a botanical garden in Washington, D.C., in Southeast D.C., Anacostia. And in it, somebody had collected, some archaeologist, some lotus seeds from a burial crypt in Pharaonic Egypt. And the seeds were a little over 2,000 years old, maybe like 2,500 years old. And they were able to get these lotus seeds to grow, actually, after all that time. And I guess being in a fairly dry, place in Egypt and inside a burial tomb, they didn't decay or get moldy or decayed, but still kept their DNA intact. And so this whole idea of Purusha and Prakriti being connected to Taurus and these energies of fecundation and growth are, to me, very fascinating. The other aspect in my early years of life in the laboratory is that the chemicals alone of DNA or any kind of molecules did not seem to me to be sufficient. It was necessary, but not sufficient for life to happen. And so the idea that there's some abstract forces in the world, in this case symbolized by Taurus and the fecundation and proliferation ideas, there's some abstract concept from consciousness that gets imbued into physical matter, and then the physical matter can then take form. So I think the bulls of the horn get to be symbolic of you might say, a life force energy, to give a rose another name.
Thank you. Better check in the at the lodge. Is there anybody with raising their hands? Because I can't see them.
Yeah, Jonathan has a question.
Okay.
Maybe I should have spent some more time thinking about this question, but my understanding is that the after death states are a time of assimilation. And that's kind of what they're for, especially the Devahanic cycle.
Yes.
And then later this summer, there'll be a presentation on Kamaloka and Devahan.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that it's not mandatory to spend 1,500 years in Devahan between lives, although that's stated as the average.
Yes.
If a person meditates during life and assimilates, in other words, whatever could have happened in the Devahanic period can kind of happen in life. For example, the Pythagorean review in the evening.
Yes.
The theory being that you can't reap a second harvest, more than one harvest from the same field. That is, if you've already reaped your experiences in your meditations and your experiences every evening, for example,
Yes.
in terms of the karmic implications and so forth, and like that, how could one do better or whatever, then there's not as much to assimilate. I mean, it's already been done. You've already taken it into. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in relationship to Taurus.
Yes. So the analogy, you know, the physical, biological kind of animal world was all that stuff with the ruminants and their different stomachs. So that's, again, the correlation or correspondence of something that's happening on multiple different levels and multiple layers. And certainly doing a Pythagorean review, or as some call it, the Chela's daily review. And then in the 12-step world, we have a step 10, in which a person will do a review, usually every evening, to see what did they do during the day that was resentful or selfish or all those different kinds of things, and say, okay, what can I do better next, you know, and get that reconciliation thing happening. So clearly that would be useful for this one incarnation. And who knows, you know, it's likely that through our memories, either through dreams or through meditations, and given that we incarnate with the samskaras, so we do have a link to our cosmic, you might say, ledger or bank account from other incarnations that we can work on in this lifetime as well. And those will show up perhaps as different propensities or different strengths and weaknesses that a person has in their personality. I like the word flawsome, or flawed and awesome. we have negative things and good things about each of us. And so in doing those daily reviews, we can get a handle on that processing part, that ruminative, assimilative function. And I think what you're saying, Jonathan, is very useful, that by doing these, you know, disciplines, these sort of disciplines of self-awareness, and then exploring the deeper causes about that is really important. Recently, I was looking at the Dhammapada, and there's one little section called the elimination of distracting thoughts. And you might say that some of the samskaric residue could be distracting thoughts or distracting propensities, or, you know, little personality quirks or idiosyncrasies that we might carry into this particular incarnation. And so by doing the recommendation of the Buddha in the Dhammapada, we can then go on our meditations to explore some of the, like the Nidana, some of the deeper causes for why we are acting a certain way or reacting a certain way, or have certain likes and dislikes and certain desires and affinities and revulsions and all that kind of stuff. So doing that self-analysis is very important. The other folks that talk about this importance of self-analysis is the famous Delphic oracle in the Greek classical world, where the admonition was to know thyself. And again, it sounds like two simple words, know thyself. Okay, what does that mean? It really is something that through skill and practice, through meditations, and as we were talking about at the end of our article, the meditation on the eye of the bull, the eye of Taurus, the reddest star, Aldebaran, and getting to that one pointedness, we can then focus in on the samskaras and get a head start on some of that major function of the assimilation and rumination. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Yes,
Anyone
I do.
else? I do have another question. She writes, and this is on page 120, middle of the page, the last line on the first paragraph. Do you read it?
Yes, the one that starts with both signify.
No, it's on page 120.
Uh-huh.
She writes, Taurus sets the tone, and she has tone in these little quotes, which governs the manifestations of the mathematics of karma. That's on page 120. And I hope you have the same numbering system I do. It's about, oh gosh, on the 6th page.
I'm
I
gonna
was
say
curious about that
me
because
too,
it's
actually.
the tone. You don't see it?
No, I don't. But the idea of the mathematics of karma, as I was mentioning, the sine wave and the whole idea of Pythagorean, numbers and symbols and geometry. The geometry is a very fascinating thing. And indeed, as last fall and in January, talking about the clock and the zodiac, the geometry and the mathematics of our manifested world is a really significant thing. And I think it forms an interesting clue to some of these spiritual principles.
Mm-hmm.
So on that phrase of the mathematics of karma, you might say, well, what is all that about? And I think going back to what is karma, if we think of karma as the law of laws, or think of it as a beneficent, loving, caring function of the universe, of consciousness as it's manifesting into form, and that it's not something that's punitive or necessarily punishing, but it's sort of a cause and effect, but it's to restore balance. And so I think the mathematics of karma is going to be focused on the idea of how do we get back into some sort of homeostasis, some sort of balance in these cyclical patterns. And homeostasis is a word which just means that a biological system is running smoothly and doing its metabolism and whatnot that it's supposed to do in a regular manner. So the mathematics of karma, I think when we talk about law of laws, mathematics is very abstract. And I think as we talk about this karmic law as something abstract, Blavatsky kind of challenges the mind with the paradoxical ideas that there are abstractions which are without attributes, and mathematical things like, say, the number one, or one thing I mentioned some months ago, the square root of -1 being I, symbolized by I. You say, how can we have a thing that has no attributes? So indeed, the mathematics of karma, I think, is pointing in the direction of an attributeless law, something that's so abstract it doesn't have any particular qualities to it. So it is, in a sense, beyond the gunas, which in our manifested world are the qualities, the sattva, rajas, tamas qualities. So this is going to be something without qualities. So the mathematics of karma connected to Taurus is saying, okay, we have operating something that's very, on the one hand, mysterious, but something that's very profound. And if we think of karma both as the law of laws and of something very compassionate and loving, which is all of a sudden giving it attributes, right? We can say that it's a good thing back as we are down on our physical level of cycles and seasons and winter, spring, summer, fall. And part of that, she also talks about a dual nature of the bull in Egyptian mythology, symbolized as a white bull and a black bull. and that there's aspects of death as well. And indeed, in this whole cyclical nature, we do have birth, youth, old age, and death. I mean, these cycles have these patterns to them over and over again in nature. And those are just echoed in, say, astronomy and stars and galaxy formations and plants and animals and all sorts of things like that. So the mathematics of karma, I think, gives us a hint that there's something going on that is abstract, and it's okay. It's okay to accept things the way they are. Thank you for that, Desiree.
Sure. I once thought of it as the architect in a way, because the architect has to establish things in a very orderly, mathematical way. I don't know. It just, when I read that, I thought, oh, it's very archetypal, because, well, it's all archetypal, but in the sense of an architect almost has to set the program, and she says it sets the tone. So for me, it's like it actually has a tone, bang, and then all of the other forces resonate to it or harmonize with it to some degree. But it's the fact that it's mathematical is referring to, I think, kind of an archetype, a form of some kind, but only in the pre-matter state, or very subtle matter state. I don't know. That's just something that breezes through the head. Okay, moving on. Does anyone have any other observations, questions, comments? Kurt?
Thank you, Desiree. And I was tuning in very carefully to your words just now on that examination, on the wonderful response from Ken. And thank you, Ken, for a really fine summary and extension, really, of many of the ideas that are in that very dense article. But I just, one of the reflections that we had, and one of the most striking things, really, to me, both about the article on Aries and this article on Taurus, is that we obviously we get the correlation and connection of the zodiacal sign with both these very subtle levels. You could even say, as you're mentioning, Desiree, pre-cosmic levels of manifestation, as well as having application at multiple levels of descent in the cycle of evolution, both at the macrocosmic and at microcosmic levels. But one of the things that really struck me and stuck out for me, or stood out, not stuck out, stood out, was that Aries was connected with the fire and light of the Logos, and Taurus with the sound of the Logos. And because of that whole connection with the AUM, and actually there's a couple of paragraphs in the article where she talks about this in some detail, this capacity for sound to impress itself upon matter. So, and I think this is part of also the deeper meaning of this in relation to the earth as a symbol of the earth. You could also think it, and Ken actually brought this out, thinking of it as prakriti or even mula prakriti, right? And the interaction between what we call the logos and that primordial, pre-cosmic homogeneous substance that calls it, that the sound calling it into action, impressing upon it the laws of nature, right? That's the other way that Fohat is spoken of as the energy of ideation as it impresses itself upon cosmic substance. So it's this link between spirit and matter, and of course, it's the link of the law. It is mathematical in the deepest spiritual sense. There's an exactitude and a precision to it, and it unfolds according to number and geometry. So without really, going into more detail than that, and again, this would apply at many different levels, including just the capacity for speech, the organizational capacity and magical properties of speech and sound as they are manifest through human nature on our plane. And we were also struck about, there's a couple of passages, I don't know exactly where now, where she talks about the sound that the bull makes, right? There's that deep, sonorous cry, I guess you would call it, or even a chant that the bull creates. It's very deep, kind of primordial sound that the bull has. So anyway, there's just, and that the whole connection also with that was sound and mathematics, the logos, geometry, as it impresses itself upon a primordial matter, and fecundating it. That is, it plants the seed within matter that will then, from which the cosmos emerges, right? So anyway, just a few thoughts there.
Well, thank you for that, Kirk. Yes, I did find one quote here about the logos. I'll just read a sentence or two here. Taurus governs the throat and the voice, projections of the word made flesh. In the Vedas and Upanishads, the heavenly bull is called Vrsabham and is related to Pravana or Aum. Darius is the name. Darius is the Hindu equivalent of the Greek god Zeus, and is called bull, quote, who bellows downward, his thunder penetrating the lower heavens and striking the earth, unquote. So again, we have this sound from the bull, the bellowing downward from the heavens. And thus Indra releases Vak in the form of captive cows. And the Babylonian Enlil, whose head rivals the heavens, whose foundation is led in the pure abyss, who reposes in the land like a furious wild bull, whose horns gleam like the rays of the sun god, hurls downward the thunderous word, which echoes through the world. So again, we have, again, as Kurt was saying, the sound from the bull, either from a physical bull or from these deity, bulls from different religions and mythologies, the Dayus or the Hindus, like Zeus, that bull, Enlil, this other bull. And then we have Vak, which I think is a fascinating Sanskrit word, which is also the mother of the Vedas. Vak was also a goddess. But curiously, I'm noticing in our Bhagavad Gita study group, the word like Uvacha, meaning to speak. So even the goddess named Vak is connected to the human capacity, show us smiling, the human capacity to make words. And in my psychiatric work, lately I've been reading an old book about 100 years ago by Harry Stack Sullivan, who talks about, again, this function of the human capacity to create symbols and then words, and that sounds or something. One of the pathologies in schizophrenia is using words in a very strange way, and sometimes making up symbolic uses of words that nobody else knows. So they're like so-called neologisms, so they just make up words. But indeed, Harry Stack Sullivan and other psychologists talk about the idea that we have impressions from our infancy before we've learned language. So things happen to us. We have impressions, likes, dislikes from these pre-verbal days. And they're part of our memory that you could say are in our memory and our limbic system, but they're symbols and experiences for which we have no words. So they're unspeakable, or you might say ineffable. And even in every human life, we have those kind of experiences which we carry into adulthood. But the idea that sound from this bellowing bull or from these other thunderous sounds that penetrate the heavens and strike the earth, it's a fascinating idea. And I've seen some like YouTube videos of people playing sounds on, say, a metal plate with some sand on it, and it'll form geometrical patterns. I forget what that's called. Do you remember what that's called, Monica? But you can get sound creating geometrical forms in physical matter. It's a fascinating thing. There's also the idea of Dr. Emoto, the Japanese fellow who's used dark field microscopy to look at water molecules that get organized along different ways when you play different kinds of music. to the water molecules or say different things to the water molecules. They'll rearrange themselves. And so I think sound is a really significant thing in its relation to matter that seems even to be connected to, at our gross material Shula Sarira level, to physical medical healing, like with Chinese Qigong and other sorts of things that might use sound to organize and heal a physical body. Monica.
Somatics. Is it somatics?
Oh, cymatics. Yeah, thank you. I couldn't remember the word yet with a C. Cymatics.
Somatics. I think to me, it's just it profoundly affects me to see sound creating geometric form, because it reminds us that it's already in the sound. And when I think about just how much information sound carries in itself that's not seen until something agitates it or gets it woken up. It's just I don't know, it's just very awe-inspiring. That's all I can say about that. But she goes on she does write a little bit more about sound. It carries the germs, speaking of Taurus, it carries the germs of propensities cultivated in previous lives to be developed in this or future births. Linked to Vak, Taurus, which is basically voice sound, Taurus establishes the keynote and basis for subsequent activity. The ancient Akkadians recognized this in the name they bestowed upon the celestial bull, Te, T-E. And that meant the foundation stone, which I think is really interesting, that it's not just a stone, but it's foundational. And we also, I think about the metallic and the sound quality of stone itself, because all rock carries with it vibration. And there's something very, I don't know, resonating. That's redundant, but there's something special about certain stones that carry a sound out and the environment that it's in. But just to be the foundational tone is interesting to me. It sounds like it's something very having to do with that very ethereal matter. Probably not even matter. Maybe it's the archetype. I don't know, but yeah, it's a very interesting study.
One other connection there. That phrase that's used in the SD and elsewhere in theosophical writing about great beings incarnating, as referred to as the Word made flesh, which is from the Christian tradition, right? But that is that, like the symbol, that quote that Ken just read, sounding the keynote. And we get these really magnificent portraits, like in the Buddhist tradition. We were just thinking about this yesterday in relation to another online group, that when, in fact, yesterday being the celebration of Vesak, being the birth, the enlightenment, and the death anniversary of Gautama Buddha, but and remember the first sermon that he gave is called the first turning of the wheel, right? So it was after the night of enlightenment, and then there was this whole gestation period in which he was attempting to, well, there's many things apparently that went on there, so we're not going to try to describe it, but he was like coalescing the teaching so that it could be presented in a manner that would be of the maximum benefit for humanity. And then when he actually went to give the first sermon, which was the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, it's the way it's described in the Buddhist sutras, even the southern ones. It's often left out, actually, in many of the translations that we see today. They leave out this whole introductory part where all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and invisible beings from all the 10 directions of space assemble, and the gods assemble. to hear the word being spoken, and that in that discourse, that he not only was, the symbolism of the wheel, he set the wheel in motion. That is, he was continuing, he was moving the whole entire wheel of evolution forward, but it was not just affecting our system, but thundering somehow throughout space, right, in kind of a boundless fashion. Devas, men, and gods, all being impacted by it, and that and this was the other connection that came to me in relation to the article about the eye of the bull, because one of the things that is said in that first sermon, that Kaundinya, who was one of the five ascetics, had by virtue of that discourse, his dharma eye was opened. That is, it was an initiation, an awakening that occurred with that discourse, just by the words being spoken in the way that they were, and by the being, of course, who was embodying that wisdom, and that's where the Dharma, the Buddha, and the Sangha were reestablished on Earth by virtue of that first talk. So that triad was, embodied on Earth via that discourse. So it just again points to the magnificent and magical properties of sound and speech when they are articulated through, a being of true wisdom, how they can have such a transformative effect upon all of life and evolution.
I see this tone being rung, bang, and it resonating all through the universe. And some of those lights are picking it up brightly. Others, you can see the light, they're a little dim, but it's actually going out all through the universe, like you say. But again, you have certain bohotic hearts that are picking it up very strongly and resonating back out, almost like a call and response in a church.
Yes.
Think about it. So that's when you say that initial tone is being set, and as it resonates out, it's people, spirits like the Buddha and like Krishna and Jesus. These lights really, they're just beaming back. But all lights are being lit to some degree. It's woken up to some degree. And it's us to do that waking up.
Thank you. Thank you, Desiree. That's like the analogy of Prometheus bringing fire from Mount Olympus, a light for humanity. And the whole concept of also lighting up the higher manas in humans as well. I see David Grossman has a hand up.
Hi, David.
Hi there. Thanks for a really interesting talk. And this last part, about Bach and voice, I'm all of a sudden thinking, could we talk a little bit? We have a voice, each of us, and we're talking every day. So I'm wondering how we can take some of these higher principles and reflections on these great ones, that have been mentioned, how we might apply that to our own voice and use of it daily, and what effect we might be having with just the sounds and words we make all the time, even if it's not apparent to others necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So
earlier today, thank you for that question, David. Earlier today, Jonathan was mentioning the Pythagorean review. So indeed, as we review the day, we can also review how we used our voice and what we said. And there's some things that modern, psychologists, people have is neuro-linguistic programming, the meaning of words. And even though it's taken a bit of a weird twist, we have the politically correct use of words and how we're going to describe things and describe people. And so realizing that, words do have a significance, I think is important. Reticence is certainly, I think, one thing that we can employ as a skill, not to overly talk too much, and then be direct with our communication and have that so-called transparency. But by doing these reviews, I think is an important thing. And it's a skill like any other skill where we think about what words we're saying and what do we mean when we're saying them, that intentionality part that goes into this manifestation of spirit into matter. There's an intentionality there that we can use with our words. And it's interesting, from the science fiction world, there's the story of Dune, and in it, the one hero character, his name becomes a magical, powerful word in saying his name, and they use the sound technology in that sci-fi story. And so similarly, I think in our day-to-day life, there is somewhat of a sound technology, and that would be through leadership. If you think of Winston Churchill, galvanizing the British citizenry and soldiers in World War II to never, never, never give up, that sort of thing. So a person can use their words, or Mahatma Gandhi in India using his leadership words to liberate a nation from colonial rule. So words can be very significant.
And I think the intentionality is so important that it be driven by the heart and driven by compassion.
Yeah, motive, right?
And when we're thinking the AA 12-step world, we talk about restraint of pen and tongue. When you're in this earlier stage of personal development, you don't want to be saying all kinds of wild things or hurtful things or mean stuff. So the restraint of pen and tongue. So one other way we can monitor our own voice, that's kind of at an earlier level, but then we can get more sophisticated with the use of our words, even as far as in the New Testament, when Jesus talks about, these things and more you can do, when he was speaking, you might say, magical spells to make things happen. I see Laura has a hand up. Laura?
Oh, yes, just a little humorous side note as far as how even children recognize the power of sound when they use their famous na 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 na. They recognize the power of sound, and how annoying that sound is, that they know that is an annoying sound and they use it very deliberately.
Yes, indeed. That's a good humor. I like that. Yes.
Well, and also children, that's the first language they learn is intonation and communicating through the eyes and through how a sound goes up or down or is steady. It tells you whether or not there's a question or a statement or someone's upset or loving, cooing sounds. So sound is comes from a very rudimentary place, or a very primitive place, I should say. But
yes, very foundational. I think Monica has a question here in the room, and then I see Truth.
Well, not really a question. First of all, thank you. This is a wonderful presentation. I so appreciate. But listening to you and Des go back and forth, it made me think about something that I heard in a theosophical circle, which was all of us, man is meant to go from in his evolution from the tribal to the scientific.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a hearing of, in these tribal times, when there was one person having the leading thought or action toward the divine,
mm-hmm.
there would be a shaman.
Oh, yes.
And when people in the community were somehow not well or off balance, the shaman would ask, when did you stop singing? When did you stop dancing? When did you stop rejoicing?
Yeah.
And so what I got from that, with that theosophical thought that I had heard, was that the shaman was trying to put the person back into the intuitive part of his mind. And so with the Pythagorean review and study, we can do that. We get to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it made this student ask, well, there must be a way to reflect at the end of our day, probably with the Pythagorean or even the Dhammapada, how often throughout this day was I outside of the intuitive unnecessarily? I mean,
Yes.
you know, got to drive the car, got to do the, you know, the physical reality of it all. But that line of intuition that connects with the higher self and influences it, there are many ways that we can definitely be distracted from it. And so it just made me think of all of these ideas, and we can find our own way individually. We don't really need the shaman. It's part of the shift, I believe, from the tribal to the scientific, where we can say, wait, there must have been a more intuitive way to handle this, that which would be for the highest good of all. So.
Mhm. Yes, indeed. Thank you for that. And you know, in the Southwest, in Arizona, New Mexico, the Navajo tribal people, their shamans are called singers, and they do healing chants. And sort of like with managed care, they go 1 day, 2 days. The longest one is a 5-day healing chant.
Wow.
So they had their own primitive managed care back in those days. But they would use singing, they would use sound and vibration.
Mhm.
Well, let's go to truth as we're winding down here.
But
And then
yes,
Stacia.
since you're familiar with both, I'm not that familiar with either one of them in depth. But do you see any connection between this 12-step program and the 12 nidanas, or the cycles of dependent origination, and the 12 signs of the zodiac?
Wow, what a question. I know there's 12 disciples at the Last Supper, but I had never thought about about the connection between a 12-step. You know, it did evolve from some very spiritual principles, but European ones, but they do have correlations with other things like the Buddhist nidanas. I'll definitely look into that and give that some pondering. See if there's a connection between the 12-step process and the dependent origination of the nidanas.
Well, on just glossing over it, it seems that there's a cultivation of sobriety, and with the astrological system, there's an analogy to like agrarian cultivation of the self and community.
Very much so. And like in that quote, which I think I actually accidentally read twice, that Helen Valborg says, each human has to go through the cycle of 12 and mastering each of them as we're on our obligatory pilgrimage. So yeah, there is a developmental process in the cycle of the 12 zodiacal signs. How about Stacia Brown?
Yes, thank you. And please excuse, my ignorance on a lot of this. But you had spoke of the Tamas and being associated with Taurus. There was a slide and you spoke about Tamas and Taurus.
Yes, yes.
And
you have a question about the gunas, the 3 gunas?
yes, a question about the gunas. And my limited understanding is what I think when you see and the eye is opened and all is illumined is a quote I have heard in the past, is that it's about the transmutation of that, like could it be of the rajas to a sattva, more into a balance where there's excess to bring it into balance of neutrality. I mean, because isn't Taurus very materialistic, desire driven? And once you can go from that desire to aspiration, then you wouldn't have to return. Do you understand? Am I making myself clear at all?
Actually, I think so. And starting with the 3 gunas, supposedly, as we've been teaching, and I too am a student of theosophy on the learning curve, the 3 gunas are qualities of manifested form. So everything that's in the world of manifestation has those 3 qualities. And one way I like to think about, again, we were talking with Desiree about mathematical stuff. If you have just a simple algebra equation of x, y, z, So they could have the three gunas are X, Y, and Z, and then each one has a coefficient, like A of X, B of Y, C of Z equals the whole thing, which would be like the whole personality. And the Nidana is connected to Taurus with the Samskara, and the opposite one on the other side of the zodiac was Scorpio and Tanha, or desire. So there is a linkage between Taurus and desire. But as one goes through the cycle of the 12 signs, again, we want to let go of Tanha, let go of that desire, so that we're then liberated, as Jonathan was mentioning, in the Devachanic stage, and don't have to reincarnate at the end. We can stay in maybe get up, advance to the Trikaya state or something fancy like that, and become a Nirmanakaya. I hope any other comments about the Tamasic connection to Taurus? I think we're good. Let me turn back to our hostess tonight. Monica, do you want to close us out?
Oh, I can close you out.
Desiree. Okay. Well, I got confused because you're right, Desiree, you're the host.
Talk about the Sphinx for next week.
Yes, just a reminder that we have the Sphinx coming up next Saturday. Really encourage everyone to hop online and take advantage of that opportunity to learn a lot more about the Sphinx. And I'm so happy that you're here with us tonight. I hope you learned something and enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much to Ken, Dr. Campos, for providing that very comprehensive review of Taurus. And again, everybody have a wonderful evening and good night for now.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Happy Memorial Day in the Americans.
Thank you, Ken.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Desiree.
Namaste.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Are we hitting end?
Yeah.